The beat. Donald Trump campaigned on many big issues. He leaned into concerns that are real for Americans, like high prices and an immigration surge that's the largest on record. Surveys show many people think Trump would help the economy and these high prices. And he has spoken about those issues since the election, but I can tell you, tonight, there is news showing he is often more focused than most president-elects on settling scores instead of those issues. He's trying now to take a pollster to court, an unusual, pretty shaky legal case, which argues that a poll he didn't like is some kind of civil fraud. And so Trump is actually filing this new lawsuit against the Des Moines Register and its pollster. It's one of several targets he mentioned in his news conference. And even more than the first term, Trump has been more direct about going after his perceived critics this way, including possibly abusing power to harm even just businesses associated with anything that he views as critical.
NBC and CNN refused to air my victory speech. Think of it. Because they are crooked, they're dishonest, and frankly, they should have their licenses or whatever they have taken away.
I think ABC took a big hit last night. I mean, to be honest, they're a news organization. They have to be licensed to do it. They ought to take away their license for the way they did that.
So CBS gets a license, and the license is based on honesty. I think they have to take their license away.
They could be him as the leader of the incoming administration, and this is how Trump is talking now. Again, not about egg prices. Now, he was a frequent litigant in private life, and during his first run for the presidency, he did talk about using libel and defamation laws and things that do exist, but expanding them to go after the press.
I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. So we're going to open up those libel laws, folks, and we're going to have people sue you like you never got sued before.
This is an approach that is all about Trump. It is not actually a party thing or red and blue, even though we are often encouraged to think in those polarized terms. But just consider lifelong Republican Liz Cheney, okay? She and her father are the pinnacle of the Republican Party. She was in Republican leadership in the Trump era, supported Trump in 2020. Right now, she's facing an orchestrated effort to abuse the power of the incoming administration to punish her because even though she supported Trump in 2020, she wouldn't join the Jan 6 coup and then held him accountable for it. Now, there's no public evidence that Cheney broke any laws in that work, no investigative reporting or credible testimony, and if there were, I would bring it to you, but there isn't for her. Yet some Republicans in Congress are now putting out materials simply asserting that as a member of Congress, she likely broke laws. Trump recently called for her to be jailed again. She's on his enemies list. And the Republicans helping Trump do not seem to care about the truth of those assertions or even the self-interest, if you want to call it that these tools are already being used against Republicans. So it could be them next. Something Mike Pence saw with the calls to hang Mike Pence and the assorted efforts against him. You could be the top of Trump's team and then next in line for the president, but it will not reduce the attacks if they decide to come after you. So Republicans are doing this and may rue the day. But that's just some of the pressure. We're also seeing people with big business interests warm to Trump right now. And these things are related. And there's also a potential way to stop this in its tracks. And I have all of this story for you tonight in this segment, in this report. But for the context, I want to show you many of these people in business and tech were on record warning against Trump. Now there are new tech donations pouring into him. Choreograph CEO visits to Mar-a-Lago. It's a big shift.
It's really dangerous to demonize the media. It's dangerous to call the media lowlifes. It's dangerous to say that they're the enemy of the people.
As an immigrant and a refugee, I certainly find this election deeply offensive.
There are some values which are really near and dear to your heart. It's foundational and something which you should never compromise on. And
it doesn't seem to have the sort of character that reflects well in the United States.
Presumably, they said those things at the time because they either believed them or thought that they were somehow right or right for their companies, but they're all now walking it back. Elon, of course, making the full switch. Now, Trump uses pressure. He uses lawsuits and intimidation tactics. That's been true his whole career. He thinks it works. That's part of why he wasn't new to some of these political pressure techniques when he first ran for president and was deemed new to politics. but not new to hardball tactics in court and elsewhere. And he used private civil suits. And there were accusations that he abused government power in his first term to go after Amazon, to try to punish the parent company of CNN. He relishes how this all works. Indeed, he has referred to the shift I'm telling you about, these critics under pressure turning, with his own brand of sarcasm.
The first term, everybody was fighting me. In this term, everybody wants to be my friend. I don't know. My personality changed or something.
Now, it's one of those statements where he may not actually think his personality has changed. He's arguing they've changed. And Trump's gotten quite explicit, even radical, with threats of retribution against perceived foes. Doubling down. When he was on defense after the insurrection, tech companies applied the standard, like normal policies. They draw lines at fomenting violence. So if you go on Facebook and do that, if you say telling people to attack your neighbor violently, or in this case, the Capitol, you get booted, which he did. Remember, Trump sued Zuckerberg's Facebook over what you see on your screen, being suspended for 2 years after Jan 6. He began lumping Facebook in with the enemy talk that he knowingly applies to Democrats and journalists, then saying Facebook was then an enemy of the people. He even threatened to throw Mark Zuckerberg in jail. That's the recent pressure campaign. And while some think that billionaires like Bezos and Zuckerberg have the power and money to confront and counter such tactics, they have clearly decided to try to give in to Trump, switching from that public criticism I showed you to meetings designed to show a warmth. Bezos publicly praising Trump, Zuckerberg down at Mar-a-Lago. And while in general, let's be clear, possibly holding a meeting with an incoming government official or a president-elect can be a routine measure, for sure. But these are not routine meetings. For one, Trump has not even retracted the threats against these people he's meeting with, threats that would likely be illegal if carried out. Opening a case against someone because of their free speech about you is selective prosecution. Judges toss those cases. Imagine being a billionaire and still going to meet with someone who holds that position, threatening to ruin your company, career, and life, even with potential imprisonment. So that's not routine. Two, these meetings are not routine because Trump uses them to push around the billionaires. Take the very criminal insurrection that prompted Facebook to suspend Trump's account, as it does anyone who uses the platform to stoke violence. Trump found a way to make it seem like Zuckerberg might not view those convicted attackers and seditionists as negatively as he did when his company was booting Trump off the platform over that attack. And here's the context. Radical defenders of Jan 6 have claimed that the prisoners and defendants are the true victims. They even made a recording of inmates, prisoners, singing the national anthem. And the nonpartisan AP reported that Music for Trump sort of whitewashes Jan 6 with a song. And check this out. It was that prisoner rendition of the song which Trump had Zuckerberg kind of salute whether Zuckerberg knew it or not. After dinner at Mar-a-Lago, the Wall Street Journal reports Zuckerberg and other attendees stood, hand over heart, as they played a rendition of the anthem sung by imprisoned defendants accused of crimes related to the Capitol riot. So in Trump's world, again, not a routine meeting, in Trump's world, Zuckerberg is now tied to that song, which is presented as some kind of propaganda tribute to people accused of or perhaps convicted of crimes against police and the nation. Trump also vowing pardons for all of them. Now, some might argue that the song is just more Trumpian theater. It's not actual policy, they might say, or not an FBI plan. But dig a little bit deeper, and you'll find that the song's anti-FBI agenda was first hatched by a group of Trump activists and vets, including Kash Patel. One of the producers, Kash Patel, who you see right there in the AP's report about him posting that, buy Taylor and the rest who spent millions for the coveted #1 spot because he thought the whitewash Jan 6 song could go to the top of the charts. Now, the business people might be eating their own words and say this is just good for business. There are companies who argue they have a duty to only make money above all else. But these people are also being threatened by the president-elect. They may be obeying in advance to these tactics. Patel has openly talked about pursuing an enemies list that includes the free press, Trump launching these civil suits against journalists, the new suit I told you about against this newspaper pollster. And while Bezos' money and empire have little to do with politics or the press, Trump views him as a foe because he owns the Washington Post, which is a speck on his balance sheet. And Trump may benefit from fear or overreacting to things that haven't happened or haven't happened yet. He enters a second term with these more radical nominations, including Patel, and a clear set of plans to abuse federal powers.
Sometimes revenge can be justified. Everybody on that committee, for what they did, honestly, they should go to jail. Joe could be a convicted felon with all of the things that he's done.
If I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them.
I call my attorney general. I say, listen, indict him.
If you're president again, will you lock people up?
Well, I'll give you an example. The answer is you have no choice because they're doing it to us.
The answer is yes, another word for no choice, because they're doing it to him. That's the record and the news. But there's other news now. And I promise you, if some of what you just saw is familiar, this next part is probably the most significant, the most important. And I'm going to explain it to you as we always try to do around here in plain English. Trump has admitted and telegraphed these plans before even getting back into office. He is not president yet. Everybody knows that. The current president still has all the executive power of any president, even though they call it a lame duck. That means you know he's handing over power in January, but he has all the powers. They're not reviewable, some of the executive powers, not even by the Supreme Court. And Biden officials are mulling what could be a comprehensive plan to stop much of Trump's DOJ and FBI revenge plot, which I just showed you. This is a plan that could legally completely thwart the vows to abuse federal law enforcement and prosecution, to Trump-proof any potential misuse of authority. And if it is done broadly, I can tell you as a lawyer and legal reporter, it could checkmate and stop future federal probes in their tracks in the next Trump term. For real. Here's how it would work. President Biden would point to this ample evidence that Trump is already expressing a desire, an intent to abuse power, to illicitly prosecute people who have not broken any law, naming political targets, demanding jail, without even the pretense of naming a crime or respecting any investigation. So that would be an argument that he's already targeting democracy, free speech, and vowing what could be a legal selective prosecution. And two, President Biden could say this new threat, admitted by the president-elect, is unprecedented. And three, that the Supreme Court granted the incoming president new immunity for official acts, past and future. So President Biden could, under this plan, and I'm telling you, it is a pretty wide, sweeping, bold plan, but the idea would be President Biden could answer the Supreme Court with lawful action of his own, creating new legal terrain in response to new legal terrain. And here's how it would work. I told you, plain English. Under this plan, President Biden could grant his own immunity to people who serve the country in any branch of government, in any party, who now face this documented threatened prosecution. The argument is, facing unprecedented moves by the court and the president-elect vowing these big moves, that would require an unprecedented protection of public servants. Indeed, the Biden White House could literally quote from the Supreme Court immunity ruling about how officials need some immunity from future prosecution to do their jobs. Biden could thwart a probe of Cheney or Jack Smith or other government veterans on any MAGA enemies list, quote unquote. He could do it with this comprehensive lawful use of the pardon power, issuing new preemptive pardons to stop the kind of DOJ prosecutions I just showed you they're threatening. Remember, federal probes are predicated on investigating a federal crime. if the so-called politically made-up crimes here are already pardoned, boom, you're pulling that crime right out of the legal process. If there's no threat of conviction and jail at the end of that probe, it's been pre-pardoned, then there's not much federal action there. Now, these are uncharted waters. The incoming president knows he has the immunity that he got supersized by the Supreme Court and is vowing to abuse power. An immunity that's broader, really, than anyone's seen before, with a guy making threats that go way past Nixon. So the Biden plan to preempt the abuse of those probes and thwart these revenge cases is on the table. Biden could legally do it alone. Unlike many other things you hear about, Congress and the courts are not involved in these executive pardon clemency powers. And Biden aides are reportedly considering a version of this plan. We don't know how narrow or broad. It has been reported sometimes in narrow terms. A couple of pardons here or there, or you could hit the whole enemies list, or write something broad enough to protect, like I said, people who served in government that are facing basically the kind of attacks that the Supreme Court said they should be immune from, at least in the presidential example. And all legal roads seem to lead back to January 6th. That's because Trump and Patel and these others are on a mission to try to undo what remains the greatest democracy crisis in the last century and you can tell from the way they act, the greatest problem for Donald Trump, the worst thing he's done, according to many Republicans. We've played the quotes here. So they want to basically try to reverse that convicted sedition in mind and law. And you should note, when I say all roads lead back, this pardon reporting includes exploring pardons for basically creating a type of immunity for leaders of the Jan 6 committee who faced tremendous pressure. You see Schiff and Cheney and others, Milley, who spoke out. And that would be dealing with pardons in both parties. Now, what you're hearing in this reporting is the news. The White House is considering this, and what I just mentioned, the arguments by advocates, people for this. I can also report for you that some legal experts who are well outside of MAGA also oppose this plan to Trump-proof the DOJ that I just told you about. There are Washington observers who say it just carries the risk of implying guilt to the very people who were doing the honest, good investigative work in the government, that it could set a dangerous precedent. There are lawyers who argue this is not the right way to protect long-term DOJ independence, nor present the nation with any kind of clarity. Indeed, that's a DOJ vet, Sarah Isgur, who's been rumored among some of these lists saying, I don't want the pardon even if you offered it, because it's not the right way to do it. President Biden has weeks now to decide yes or no to a plan that's clearly being considered. So to inform understanding of this plan, which could fundamentally alter Donald Trump's revenge plots in the second term, a very high-stakes thing where this current President Biden is no lame duck, and with these reported risks on both sides, we're going to hear this out, this debate, with legal experts with opposing views when we're back in 90 seconds.
Honestly, they should go to jail.
So you think Liz Cheney should go to jail?
For what they did.
Everyone on the committee, you think?
I think everybody.
If he offers it to me or other members of the committee, I think I would accept it.
I don't think pardons are necessary.
We are joined now for this big debate over Trump proofing the DOJ and revenge plans with pardons by some real legal heavy hitters. Paul Rosenzweig is a former deputy assistant secretary at DHS. And looking at this plan, he has an Atlantic piece saying Biden should pardon Trump's critics now. We're also joined by former federal prosecutor Frank Bowman. He's writing a book about the pardon power and argues the other side, writing the case against Biden pardoning everyone on Trump's enemies list, piece for Slate. Welcome to both of you. You guys are lawyers, so I'm sure you're going to love debating.
For sure. We also
For sure.
good friends, so it's not going to be too tough a debate. So
good. Paul, your opening statement.
Pardoning Trump's critics would be a completely unusual and different use of the pardon power. But it's time, I think, to think about whether or not existing authorities need to be applied in new and different ways, because Trump is a new and different threat. Right? Trump has already abused the pardon power immensely in his first term, pardoning Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, the whole 9 yards, Steve Bannon of his acolytes. Now he's threatening to throw the entire weight of the Department of Justice and the FBI behind investigations of people who, by any measure, are utterly innocent of any wrongdoing. Now, one answer to that is, well, that's okay. Then the court system will make it fine in the end, and they'll come out at the end of the day with an acquittal. But as anybody who's ever been a prosecutor or been under investigation knows, the costs of the investigation itself are immense in terms of time, money, mental stress on you and your families.
And let's be clear, I'll jump in on that evidentiary point. Regular citizens, someone who was number 5 or 10 in the Jack Smith probe, if they are targeted, it's bankrupting. I mean, there's no money to do a multi-year real case when you have the federal government going at you.
So I guess I would end my opening statement this way. It seems to me that faced with the unusual authoritarian impulse that Donald Trump has given voice to, that has been made more clear by his promises to appoint Kash Patel as FBI director and Pam Bondi, an election denier, as DOJ Attorney General. It's at least incumbent upon Biden morally and ethically to protect those who are at risk because they were on his side.
Right, and that goes to the immunity argument.
I'm not saying this is an ideal solution.
Right, not ideal. Frank, it's the holiday season. I'm going to get more lawyerly than usual. I'm going to say arguendo, okay? Arguendo. For the sake of argument, let's stipulate that you care about the rule of law, oppose attacks on democracy, all the rest. Let's clear that out and say you care about all that, but this is a bad idea. Why?
It's a bad idea because, first of all, it does create a terrible precedent, and I think we should not necessarily, as Paul suggests the contrary, I don't think we should necessarily do unprecedented things as president to anticipate unprecedented bad things that Trump might do. The precedent it creates is essentially the threat of creating in the future what we call a regime of impunity, essentially a situation where for all future administrations, the practice becomes we simply preemptively pardon everybody who worked for us, whether they did anything bad or not. And that creates an expectation among one's presidential employees that you can do pretty much any darn thing you want to, any awful thing.
Let me jump in to tease out your point. When Paul says, well, Trump term 1 already pardoned a bunch of political folks, your response here right now is, yes, but it could have been hundreds or thousands, and then you have no deterrent law enforcement effect on federal officials. Is that your argument?
I think that's one argument. I think the more important thing is Paul and I definitely agree that what Trump is offering to do here, and Kash Patel's offering to do, is unprecedented and it's ghastly. Got it. The problem is that pardons don't solve your problem. They don't solve your problem for a number of reasons. First, who are you going to pardon? Just the people on Kash Patel's enemy list. You pardon the people on the January 6th committee. The list of people who could be attacked by the Justice Department is almost endless.
But that's a very lawyerly argument, Frank. I'm going to say it. No offense. It's extremely lawyerly because you could be over-inclusive. You could pardon 300 people, and they're still going to bother other people. But your point would be there should be a type of pardon-based immunity for, say, anyone who investigated Jan 6, given that it was a national security event and they want to turn it around. What do you say to that?
Well, if you're talking about January the 6th, I mean, for example, let's take an example of the problem. You've got Trump saying, and you had him recorded as saying, okay, all 6 committees should be prosecuted. They should be in jail. Okay, that's a horrible thing to say. First of all, those people are in no real risk because they have protection already under the Speech and Debate Clause. But let's assume we pardon them as some sort of preemptive protection. Well, what about all the people who worked on the committee? What about all the witnesses? How big does your list have to be in order to cover the folks you need to cover?
Paul?
Well, I mean, Frank's right that at some point you've got to draw a line. But I think the response is you've got to draw a line. But the fact is that Trump is the one who's forcing us to do the drawing. You know, for myself, if I had to put names on the list, I'd put Liz Cheney, Anthony Fauci, Mark Milley, the highlights of the highlights, who are guaranteed to be in his sights and in Kash Patel's sights. Can we do the staff on the committee? Of course we could. But the fact that there might be some people who aren't protected by this doesn't mean that you shouldn't make an effort to at least provide what protection you can to the people who you reasonably think might be the most within the ambit of his threat.
Let me move it back to Frank.
They can say no.
All right, so I got to moderate. It's three lawyers. Moving off the practicality, Frank, what is the other argument? You mentioned precedent and just sort of the larger, almost scale of U.S. governance beyond the practical concern you mentioned.
Well, the other thing I want to mention really is a practical one, and it goes back, frankly, to all the reporting that you did at the top of the hour. What is the point, do you think, of Trump's threats, of Patel's threats? Well, A, it's to state Trump's thirst for revenge. B, it's to provide, some material for the right-wing media. But the real point of it is to create intimidation. It's to create fear. It's to modify people's behavior. Okay. You don't need the Department of Justice or the criminal justice process to do that. If our whole argument here, our discussion is premised on the notion that Trump is going to misuse the law in every way he conceivably can think of doing so. And you led this story with infinite number of circumstances of uses of federal power and law that aren't criminal at all.
Now I'm
going to be quite effective.
I'm rolling over on time. Paul, you get a mini closed. 2 sentences. Sorry.
Save who you can when you can. Frank's right that I can't stop state criminal prosecutions or civil suits, but what we can do is protect the people who deserve it, morally and ethically.
Really interesting. This is how this works. We actually set aside quite a bit of time, but now we're approaching the half-hour mark. I'd love to have you both back, Paul and Frank, a civil and expert debate. Appreciate both of you. If people are wondering why we're running out of time, we got the Muppets coming up. Ron Howard is here by the end of the hour. That's going to be great. But first, Republicans doubling down on crime. This is different than the top story we mentioned, but something I want to show you for the record before we get to the Muppets by the end of the hour. Here's a tradition you probably know. The Electoral College meets and formalizes how states voted in the presidential election. You're looking at footage from when this has happened before. It's also happening today. So this year, they are formalizing electing Trump. 4 years ago, it was electing Biden by those formal electors. Now, this vote is straightforward. Last cycle, the losing Trump campaign tried to draw electors into some of their later indicted crimes. You can see it was actually one of the earliest plots, second to lawsuits, right there in the way we've been tracking it. Some Republicans who helped lie about electors later backtracked or apologized under legal pressure. Others doubled down, and the party is embracing politically motivated crime today. And it's on display right now because the GOP featured 8 indicted electors from last time in this vote today. These electors cannot get a federal pardon from Trump in the future because these are in state courts. And the party is blatantly embracing lying electors as Republican electors this year, which shows a very public preference to reward people who tried to steal a lost election over what you would want to celebrate if you were just for democracy, which is that they won fair and square this time. Why bring back the losers and the liars? Because it's part of this broader effort. Now, Harris has conceded, so she's following the law, so she's not trying to get electors to cheat today. She also gave some new remarks, her most lengthy since her concession speech, telling people to stay in the fight. You can see her there going up to give those recent remarks. Her aides are also talking a bit more about the headwinds they face that were out of their control, the economy, the anti-incumbent mood, plus areas where they say Republicans were effective.
Whether you're white, black, whatever the case may be, you have a perception about the economy. If you think the economy sucks It doesn't get better if there's a black candidate.
This was a race that was anchored around an issue that people in this country cared most about, which was the economy. There were big headwinds that we were facing as part of the administration.
I can guarantee you if we had had an open Democratic primary that the Democratic coalition would have been so fractured that we would have guaranteed a loss.
The right is getting really good at setting culture with anti-institutional voters, and those are those persuadable voters.
The last voice, a top Harris aide discussing culture. How Democrats are losing hold of what is the emerging culture and becoming what many voters see as the embodiment of the status quo and a distrust of establishment figures, which can be established by media trends. A Harris aide telling the outlet Semaphore this year's media sensations were independent, non-traditional personalities online against the establishment. Culture matters. It usually leads politics. It comes first, not the other way around. Culture is something we focused on, frankly, on this very program, The Beat. From the power of new voices in the podcast realm to artists channeling the new generation. And many of them have views on capitalism and freedom that could overlap with progressives or Democrats, but they often speak against traditional institutions and both parties through the language of culture and online discourse and art. Listening to the culture can help you hear new ideas and trends before they even go mainstream, let alone hit politics years later. And let's be clear, both candidates did do outreach to new voices. There can't be some false equivalency claiming that only Trump did the big podcast. You can see here two of the biggest streamer podcasts helmed by the competing candidates. But now that even Harris vets say there's a larger challenge to face, maybe it's not just about those final interviews that the campaigns do every 4 years. And maybe it's